I would like to welcome everyone to, my name's Joe Cable. I'm the director of MindCore, and I'd like to welcome everyone to the 22nd Annual Pinkel Lecture. I'm going to introduce the lecture series. I'm not going to introduce the lecturer. That will be Conrad Korting in a second, so we're a little bit like the Oscars in terms of multiple introductions here. The Pinkel Endowed lecture series was established through a generous gift from Sheila Pinkel in honor of her parents, Benjamin and Ann Pinkel. Benjamin Pinkel received his bachelor's degree in electrical engineering here at Penn in 1930, and throughout his life was actively interested in the philosophy of the mind. In 1992, he published a monograph on the subject entitled Consciousness, Matter, and Energy, The Emergence of Mind in Nature. And the objective of that book was a re-examination of the mind-body problem in light of new scientific information. And this lecture series is intended to advance the discussions of the questions which engaged Dr. Pinkel's investigations. And it's really been a highlight of the year within the cognitive science community here at Penn every year. And as a token of our gratitude for coming today to talk to us, we have a copy of the monograph.
Thank you very much. Thanks.
And with that, I will hand off to Conrad for an introduction of our speaker.
Great. So it's a real delight to have Matt Botvinick here, because there's very few people who can really spread that gap that we usually have between artificial intelligence and real intelligence, if that's what we call our own state of mind. Matt Botvinick looks back, obviously, to an amazing career where I hear started doing art history.
Yeah.
And then through a set of steps, moved into this amazing cross-disciplinary position where he sits at the moment. Let me read a few of his dates. He was an undergraduate at Stanford University, moved to Cornell, got a PhD in psychology and cognitive science at CMU, and then he came to the right place, which is here. And then afterwards he went to Princeton, and then he went to DeepMind in London. And in any case, I'm very much looking forward to your talk.
Thank you very much. Thanks. Thank you. Thanks so much. Thanks. It's amazing to be back here. Yeah, I mean, so much has changed. It's really exciting to see how the different units of neuroscientists and neurologists and psychologists have gotten spatially more clustered, which is really just a wonderful thing. And this building is amazing. Yeah, Penn will always have a special place in my heart. I mean, it's really where I started my scientific career. There's another thing I owe, another sort of beginning that I owe to Penn, because my parents were undergrads here, and they actually met right outside the Hill House. So you might say that I got my start here in a different way. And I still live in Philadelphia. So I work in London, but I commute. I have an extreme commute, but I really like still being here, still being based nearby. So, but I have moved in my career to some different kind of zones of inquiry, you might say, and I'm looking forward to telling you a little bit about what I've observed in those other zones. To be honest, I scanned the audience as I was being introduced, and I'm like, I don't want to be shocked in the middle of my talk. Oh my God, you. So I'm primed. I want to kind of bring back to this community some of the things that have struck me in the AI world that I'm inhabiting. And try to make some connections to neuroscience and psychology, because I think they're potentially pretty exciting. So let's dive in with that. So needless to say, in AI, there's been a lot of excitement over the last several years in what we now call deep learning, what many of us here used to call artificial neural networks or connectionist networks. We don't call them that anymore for some reason. And it was all sparked really by a particular event, this kind of resurgence in neural networks in AI, which was this 2012 victory in a competition to classify images, the ImageNet competition. This victory by a group using convolutional neural networks, and that was really, for a lot of people in machine learning, kind of unthinkable that artificial neural networks could do that kind of stuff, that they could deal with that kind of rich data. So that blew a lot of minds and got a lot of people in AI sort of herding back to artificial neural networks. And when I say that there's interest in AI, like I mean it. So this is a 2012 paper, and it has, look at how many citations it has. And this is a few days ago. It's gone up, I guarantee you. And one thing that's been exciting to see is that this resurgence of interest in neural networks in AI has stimulated renewed interest in artificial neural networks in neuroscience and psychology. So, there are any number of papers that have come out over the last few years that are really high profile and considered really legit and interesting. For example, the stuff that Dan Yeomans and Jim DiCarlo have done, comparing convolutional neural network activity to real neurons in ventral stream, or the kind of stuff that Montecillo and Newsom have done, comparing the activity of artificial recurrent neural networks to the activity in real recurrent networks in the prefrontal cortex. And this does my heart good because I went to grad school in the 90s when neural networks were like, that was the first real golden age of neural network research. And these books, which really introduced multi-layer artificial neural networks and backpropagation to the cognitive science community, these books are literally, very literally, the reason that I got into science. Somebody handed them to me and I went, I want to do this. And I left medicine and went into science. By the way, raise your hand if you know these books, if you're familiar with these books. Okay, that's good. That's better than what I see in like machine learning groups. They think neural networks started in 2012. It's very frustrating. Anyway, so this is all nice for me. And like, as somebody who's been around in the biz that long, I kind of have to smile wanly when I look at some of these new pieces of research, because they look awfully similar to stuff that I know from like the 80s. So, you look at Yeomans and DiCarlo, as awesome as that work is, I'm not taking anything away from that work. I love that work. But they didn't invent this stuff. If you look back in 1988, there was really cool work shortly after the invention of backpropagation, comparing what happens in the middle of backprop nets and what happens in parietal lobe, looking at receptive fields in a very detailed way, within a very similar research spirit, really. When you look at this Montecillo, Shania Newsom study, the approach is really similar to work that was published in 1991, looking at what happens in recurrent neural networks, artificial neural networks during working memory tasks, and what you actually see in real biological neurons. Now, obviously, the neural data that we're looking at in these studies is much, much richer now than back in the 80s and 90s. So things have really changed. And of course, the neural networks that we can build and train are much, much bigger and much, much more interesting than the ones that we could play with back then. I mean, this is like 5 orders of magnitude more computing power than what was available when I was in grad school. But at the same time, it is kind of nice for someone like me to see that, we're coming back to a style of research that was exciting to me when I was first getting into grad school. However, there's also a bit of frustration for me when I look at what's going on in psychology and neuroscience in connection with deep learning, because there actually is stuff going on in AI that is new, that hasn't been around since 1988, and that I think is actually more important for neuroscience and psychology. Like something that has more profound implications for what we're trying to do when we sit down to study the brain and behavior. And I just don't see psychologists and neuroscientists at the same kind of scale talking about this area of work, and that's what I want to kind of try to fix by going around giving this talk. So what am I talking about? I'm talking about deep reinforcement learning. This is what, so if the PDP books are what got me into science in the first place, deep reinforcement learning is what got me to leave my academic position and go see what was going on at DeepMind. And I'm still, after 5 years there, very excited about it, and very excited about its implications for neuroscience, which I don't think have been explored as deeply as they should be. So let me tell you what I'm talking about. So I know this is a diverse audience, so I'm just going to kind of put some fundamentals in place. And for those of you who know what I'm talking about, just feel free to check your email until I get back to new stuff. So what is reinforcement learning? Reinforcement learning is defined, it's easy to define it in contrast with something else called supervised learning. What is supervised learning? Well, supervised learning is the strategy that's used in most deep learning research, at least most deep learning research that neuroscientists pay attention to. And what it is you present some input to a neural network, the network gives you an output, and if the output isn't the one you want, then you tell the network exactly what you did want. So if you give it a picture of a car, and at the output side it activates a unit that corresponds to the label bicycle, you don't just say that's wrong, you say that's wrong, and you should have said car. So the error signal is based on privileged information that would come from something like a teacher, right? And that's a fine problem definition, and it's worthy of research. But reinforcement learning is something different. Reinforcement learning involves, like, the problem formulation is different. You have an agent that on the output side, it's emitting actions. And then when, so on the input side, it's getting some representation of the state of the environment. So it's still an input-output mapping like before. But when the agent outputs an action, it doesn't get any explicit information about what it should have done. Instead, all it gets is what's conventionally called a reward signal, which is just a number that indicates how good or bad the outcome was. Now, this may sound awfully similar to supervised learning, but it's really fundamentally different. And here are 3 ways in which reinforcement learning is different. One is that when you build reinforcement learning systems, you're putting the onus on them to discover the solution to the problem. So in a supervised setting, you're literally telling the system what it should do. In an RL setting, you're just telling it, oh, that was good, that wasn't so good, that was really good. And so the system has to figure out in a more independent way, or a more creative way, really, what the best thing to do is, what the optimal behavioral policy is. Which means in practice that reinforcement learning systems can surprise you. They can come up with solutions to problems that you thought you understood. And you go, oh my God, I didn't think of that solution. Which is an exciting thing. Of course, animals can do that too, and other humans can do that. Second, there's something called an explore-exploit dilemma that's inherent in reinforcement learning. Because you're not being told exactly what to do, you're never sure whether you found the best thing. So if I do something and I find out I get like a large reward for that, well, that's nice. But it doesn't necessarily mean that there's not something else I could have done that would give me even more reward. And so I have to explore, I have to try things out. And it would also be stupid for me to try things out and try things out and try things out and never use the information that I've gathered along the way. Like, the right thing to do is sort of try things out until you kind of understand what's going on, and then stick with the thing that you've decided works best. You should transition from exploration to exploitation of your knowledge, and that's a difficult balance to strike. The third thing is that's important is, and it's not really inherent to reinforcement learning, but it just happens to be associated with the kind of setup that reinforcement learning researchers tend to adopt, which is we tend to assume that this agent is in a closed loop with the environment. So it's not just I get some representation of the world state and I select an action, but that action affects the state of the world. So there's this kind of sensory motor loop going on, and that also means that I can be in a sequential setting where in order to reach some sort of goal or reward, I actually have to do several things in a row. And so I have to reason about sequences of actions and cumulative reward, and that changes things a lot. Of course, that again is kind of reminiscent of like real animal and human behavior. So Reinforcement learning, as many of you will know, is also not new. In fact, what most of us consider sort of the Bible of reinforcement learning, this book by Sutton and Barta, was written in the early 90s. And in fact, just like those PDP books, if you go into this book, you'll find that most of what we talk about now in reinforcement learning research is like already there in the early 90s, in the late 90s, sorry. In particular, the kinds of algorithms that we use to improve behavior based on reward. So the most emblematic example of this is something called temporal difference learning. We'll talk a little bit more about this as we go along, so I'll just introduce it to those of you who aren't familiar with it. The basic idea is that this agent is at every step kind of calculating an estimate of how well it thinks its life is going. Like, how good are things right now? How much, more specifically, how much reward can I expect in the future given where I am right now? And then, that estimate is probably pretty inaccurate when the agent's first exploring an environment, but importantly, it also pays attention to how surprised it is when it receives reward. So if it thought things were going great and then it got a really negative reward, that would trigger a negative reward prediction error. If it thought things were going poorly and it got a big positive reward that it wasn't expecting, that's a positive reward prediction error. And you can maybe intuit how those kinds of reward prediction errors could be used to update the estimate for how well life is going, this value representation. And the better your value representation, the better position you're in to choose good actions, because you just think, well, if I do this, then I can anticipate that life would look this good. If I do that, then I can anticipate that life would look less good, so I'll do this. That's the whole intuition behind temporal difference learning. Again, just acknowledging that many of you are familiar with the math underlying this. So the RPE updates its value estimate. Okay, so reinforcement learning has kind of been mature in that sense for a long time, but there's always been a problem. And the problem has to do with representation. So many of you who've read reinforcement learning papers or played with reinforcement learning algorithms know that, especially in the applications that have been made in neuroscience and psychology, usually the representation of the state of the world is extremely dumb. It's usually what's called a tabular representation. Like, every particular state of the world is represented as a completely separate thing. Like, you have an agent that needs to go around this little world, navigate around this little world, and each of those cells is just its own completely separate, unrelated thing. Maybe if you go crazy, you might represent the fact that adjacent states are somehow similar, but that would be really exotic. This is not good for modeling intelligent behavior in general, because it doesn't give us any way of understanding generalization. It doesn't give us any way of imagining how an agent would enter into a situation that's not identical to one that it's encountered before, and the agent would say, oh, well, this isn't exactly like a situation I've dealt with before, but I kind of know what to do. I mean, I'm doing this right now. I've never lectured in this room before, but I think I know how to behave based on the similarity of this situation to others that well, you can tell me later. The similarity between the situation and others. And that's what psychology is really largely about, is how do you represent the world and the similarities between things and, the analogies between things. And this impoverished way of representing state just doesn't give us any way of thinking about that. So people doing reinforcement learning research this point has not been lost on them. And there have been many efforts over the years to enrich the representations that can be fed into RL algorithms, but it's hard. So yeah, some progress was made on coming up with feature-based representations that could be form the basis of linear value function approximation. But linear is not that great. I'm not computing some linear function of my retinal input right now. I'm computing a hugely nonlinear function that tells me I'm in a lecture hall, etc. So we really need something nonlinear. But it hasn't been clear how to get those reinforcement learning algorithms to work well with nonlinear learnable functions. And the dream from early on has been to merge reinforcement learning with, guess what? Deep learning. Because deep learning is all about learning nonlinear functions. And there was an early sign that maybe this could be made to work. And this is very famous work by Tesaro, actually parallel work by Lin, using a combination of deep learning and reinforcement learning to play backgammon. This is a system called nicknamed TD Gammon. And the idea is pretty straightforward, given what I've told you so far. You take an input which represents the position of the pieces, the positions of the pieces on the board, and you put it through a multi-layer neural network, which is trained with backpropagation. But rather than giving it a supervisory training signal, telling it exactly what to do, you just let it play games and see whether it wins. And if it wins, then you backpropagate through the system and say, yeah, do that more, do that more. But more importantly, learn internal representations of the board that will prompt you to do those smart things more. So this actually worked pretty well, and it encouraged people to think that maybe we could combine deep learning with reinforcement learning. But it turned out not to be so simple. For some reason, Tesaro in this particular domain kind of got lucky. And this worked, but the methods that he used turned out not to translate to other domains. The basic wisdom about, up until like 2015, was that combining deep learning with RL is unstable. Maybe every once in a while you can get something interesting to happen, but in general, the system's just gonna blow up. The parameters diverge, and you just get junk. Now, this all changed in 2015, and this paper that came out of DeepMind, but it was before I was there, so I can't brag about it, really was like the analog in DeepRL to that ImageNet paper that I mentioned before in supervised deep learning. Like, this was the shot that was heard around the world. And what happened here was some people at DeepMind, when DeepMind was just starting, figured out some kind of tricks to get deep learning to work with reinforcement learning in a stable way. And they applied this to a bunch of classic Atari games and showed that in many cases, their system ended up playing a mean game of Atari, like better than humans. But really, like, that wasn't the headline. The headline was, we have figured out a way of getting deep learning and the nonlinear representation learning that it involves to pair with reinforcement learning, so that the reinforcement learning feedback is driving the deep learning. And that was the big news. And again, I mean, on the surface, it looks very much like TD gammon. There was some, like, we can talk maybe later if people are interested in what were these little tricks. But the top level story was the same. You've got a deep neural network. It's taking in pictures of the screen in the Atari game. And at the output end, it has some actions which correspond to joystick movements. But, you know, it's the same thing. The system was maintaining estimates of how good each action was, and then in expectation, and then it was using its surprise signals, its RPEs, to update those, and that just worked. Moreover, it turned out that the techniques that were introduced here really did generalize. The same basic ideas, the same little tweaks, the same little tricks ended up allowing DeepRL to work stably in actually much richer domains. So for those of you who track this literature, you'll recognize a series of results that I'm about to celebrate. So DeepMind had a Nature paper last year showing that, like, something very much like the same techniques could be used to play this, like, outrageously complicated computer game StarCraft. The same basic techniques are being used for continuous control and robotics tasks. You can use basically the same techniques to do multi-agent RL, so you can get agents that are taking in pixel-level inputs, like the agents are literally looking at that kind of screen, and they're learning how to play capture the flag, learning to collaborate with their teammates and compete with the other team. All learned from scratch, all learned just by reward signals. Did you win the game or not? And importantly, the paradigm has been extended to build in other kinds of components. So what I've described so far is called model-free reinforcement learning. You do stuff, you see how well it goes, you update your way of behaving. You don't worry about building a causal model of the world. You don't worry about learning, oh, if I do this, then that will happen, and then if I do that, that will happen, and that way I can plan, I can think about future trajectories. That latter scenario is referred to as model-based reinforcement learning, and it wasn't part of the early Atari work, but very soon after that, people at DeepMind started figuring out how to combine these things. So you do a little model-free RL, and then you do some tree search into the future and see if you can update your estimates of how well life is going. This kind of combination turned out to work amazingly well in board games like Go and chess. So if you've heard of AlphaGo, that's the basic idea. And then, like all sorts of other ingredients were incorporated. So it wasn't long before people were coming up with cool memory systems, like slot-based memory systems that worked very much like episodic memory. You could search with a kind of a search template and then retrieve something in a similarity-based way. And that kind of search and retrieval mechanism was learnable through backpropagation. So you can have agents that were trained through RL to do things like reason about family trees and things like that. So this thing started to grow very quickly, not only in terms of the scale of problems it was being applied to, but also the agent architectures that seemed to be tractably buildable. And it's just burgeoning. Every day I go to DeepMind and there's some cool new thing going on in that space. Okay, but that's all actually just telling you what DeepRL is. I haven't said anything yet about this other part of my talk. So I said at the beginning that I thought neuroscientists and psychologists should know more about DeepRL and should pay more attention to it because it has profound implications for what we're up to. And so let me turn to that. So the first thing to say is really easy, which is, well, look, DeepRL is made up of two ingredients, deep learning and RL. And like both of those independently have already been hugely useful to neuroscience and psychology. Like this is just a no-brainer, so to speak, if that isn't kind of the wrong expression to use. So this work I referred to before, applying deep learning, I mean, hopefully most of us agree this is worthwhile. Like deep learning, whatever nitpicks you want to apply to this kind of work, like it's probably worth looking at how these deep learning systems relate to brain systems. And what I haven't said yet, but many of you will know in gory detail, is that there's also a parallel story with reinforcement learning. Reinforcement learning algorithms. Not many people know that reinforcement learning algorithms were invented out of an effort to understand animal learning. So Andy Bartow and Rich Sutton were actually thinking about animal conditioning experiments when they came up with temporal difference learning. But what happened soon after that was it kind of came full circle, and a group of people, including Peter Dayan, were looking at dopamine data from places like Wolfram Schultz's lab and said, geez, what dopamine's doing looks an awful lot like the temporal difference prediction error in TD learning. And of course that led to this, really amazingly productive connection between temporal difference learning research and dopamine research, which many of you will be familiar with, and which I'll say more about. So, the basic idea is, hey, maybe the dopamine system is emitting a signal in terms of the firing rate of dopamine neurons or the volume of dopamine release that relates to the reward prediction error, and that's driving learning elsewhere in the brain, which relates to value estimates. So deep learning and RL have been important to neuroscience, but it's more than that. These fields are about something, and what they're about is important in both cases. Deep learning, to me, is about representation learning, and RL is about motivated behavior and learning to pursue goals. Together those two things span an awful lot of what I personally am interested in neuroscience and psychology. I suspect that's true of many of you as well. Deep learning, by bringing these things together, allows us to push further in understanding these, in trying to understand what underlies representation learning and motivated behavior by connecting them. So now we can ask, how are internal representations shaped by motivation? How are they shaped by reward and goals? And we can ask, how is motivated behavior, like decision making, how is that shaped by representation? So we can now kind of talk about these things in a connected way. And maybe the one provocative thing I want to say is, like, to me personally, the brain is a deep RL system. We're just trying to figure out what kind. So having made that grandiose statement, let me say it wouldn't be so cool, I don't think, if deep RL were just the sum of its parts. If deep RL were just like everything we know about deep learning plus everything we know about RL, but hey, it's fun, now we get to do them both at the same time, that would be cool, but it wouldn't be as cool as what we actually have. Because in fact, deep RL is more. It's more than the sum of its parts. Things happen in deep RL that don't happen in deep learning on its own. and they don't happen in RL without the deep learning piece. And actually, since I've been working on deep RL in an intensive way, like that's the part of it that really intrigues me. The stuff that happens only when you bring deep learning and RL together. So for the second part of my time, I want to give you some specific examples of what I'm talking about. And I'm going to do this by giving you like a kind of whirlwind tour of two papers that we've published from my group at DeepMind. The first was published in Nature really just within the last month. And the second was in Nature Neuroscience about a year and a half ago. So let's start with the more recent paper. Okay, so now I'm gonna talk about like very specific scientific issues, but I'm gonna kind of give you a high level tour of this, and I don't have time to get into a lot of the details. Really what I'm up to here is trying to give you a sense of what I mean when I say deep RL is more than the sum of its parts, and the way in which it's more than the sum of its parts is a cool thing to consider for neuroscience. So, okay, but let me get into this specific study. So, I mentioned before the mapping that's been established between temporal difference learning in RL and dopaminergic function. And one thing that will be relevant as I go forward is that in both cases, the reward prediction error signal and the value estimate are both just scalars, right? They're just ordinary, like, numbers, single numbers. The amount of dopamine that's released, or like the number that represents the amount of reward, positive or negative. Now, sometime about 2 years ago, some people at DeepMind, including my collaborator Will Dabney, asked themselves, what would happen if we relaxed that assumption and imagined RL agents, deep RL agents, that don't represent their value function or their reward prediction error signal as single numbers, but instead represent them as vectors. And the vectors are intended to represent a full distribution over values. So here, like if we think of these as value representations, which is in fact what they are, you can imagine this Ms. Pac-Man screen leading to, like in the classical case, it would lead to a particular number that represents how well the agent thinks life is going, what the estimated value is. But instead, Will said, well, what if we represent a learned value distribution? So in this particular screen state, the agent kind of goes, well, okay, maybe in this state I might get a total of 22 points going forward, but I could also, there's a smaller possibility that I might get more like 29 points based on my past experience. Or in a continuous control case, this is a little humanoid continuous control agent jumping over a chasm, and it's like, this is like 3 frames from a video, you can think of it as that. And here what this is meant to indicate is the agent is like realizes, as represented in its value distribution, that it might make it, that's the high end of this bimodal distribution, but it might not make it, which means that it would respawn at the beginning of the track, which is not good because it loses reward. And kind of amusingly, as it sails over the chasm, you can see it getting more and more worried that it's going to fall in. And I got worried too, so I asked Will whether it did fall in, and he said no. So, no humanoids were harmed in the making of this slide. So this is something that they just tried out. But what they found, what Will and his colleagues found, is that this change really, really helped in terms of the speed and asymptotic quality of RL. So, these plots just show what you get with an ordinary scalar-based model that's based on that Atari setup. And this is what you get if you just change it so that you represent things distributionally. And this is the same thing for the continuous control agent. So this really seems like rocket fuel for RL. It turns out, for reasons I don't have time to get into, that this is a case where deep RL is more than the sum of its parts. You don't get this payoff for distributional representation if you're not using deep learning as part of the setup. If people are curious about the explanation for that, come talk to me later, but I just want to assert that so that I have time to move on and talk about a neuroscience application. So we were talking about this distributional RL thing, and it seemed kind of inviting to ask, if this is such a great payoff, could the brain be doing something like this? I mean, there are multiple literature suggesting that the brain uses distributional representations in other contexts. So it was kind of like inviting to ask, well, gee, if this is a trick that helps in artificial agents, is it possible that evolution discovered the same trick in the brain? So now what I'm going to tell you about is a neuroscience project that we undertook as inspired by that AI work. So we teamed up with Naochita at Harvard, who happened to have a data set, actually multiple data sets. I'll only tell you about one. That was like perfect for pursuing this hypothesis. And the task was super simple. Mice were given a warning cue, a tone, and then after a fixed interval, the mouse got some volume of juice reward. But the tone didn't tell the animal how much. So the moment at which the animal got that warning cue is kind of interesting. Because in a standard RL agent, the arrival of that warning cue would be associated with sort of an anticipation of the mean reward, the mean amount of juice, essentially, that the animal would later receive. But in the distributional case, the brain should be anticipating all the different amounts of juice that the animal might receive. So Now had written papers about this data set, but it analyzed the data in a classical way and had found the classical thing, which is that if you average over dopamine neurons, you see what looks like a classical reward prediction error signal. If the animal gets the largest amount of juice, you see a big spike. If the animal gets the smallest amount of juice, you see a dip, because that's actually disappointing relative to the expected value. This is just sort of the standard finding in studies of this kind. But we went at it with looking at it through a magnifying glass that distributional RL had given us. So here, so in order to frame the predictions, let's think about what the classical TD story would lead us to expect. So I said before, classical TD, everything's a scalar, everything's a single number. So there are neurons that are representing the reward prediction error, represented here by a delta, and there are other neurons that are in communication with those neurons that are representing the expected value. Those are kind of the reference points against which the surprise is computed. And importantly, there may be many dopamine neurons, but they're all computing the same number. Why the brain has a lot of neurons computing exactly the same number is an interesting question. Maybe it has something to do with noise. But that's the classical story. The distributional story is totally different. There are a bunch of dopamine neurons, but they're not all doing the same thing. They're all listening to different baselines. They're all listening to different value expectations, and they run the gamut from very pessimistic, just indicated here by blue, to very optimistic, indicated by red. And so this leads to a range of novel predictions. So the first prediction has to do with the way that you get this spectrum. And as I'll explain more as we go along, the way that you get the spectrum from pessimistic to optimistic is by taking the response function of your dopamine neuron and bending it. So some dopamine neurons really amp up their response in the positive domain, and some of them really amp up their response in the negative domain. So the first thing that we should look for, if the brain is doing something like this, is diversity in tuning curves across actual dopamine neurons. That's actually what we see. So we linearize the response of these actual dopamine neurons in the positive and negative domains through methods that I can explain to people separately if you're interested. You don't have to do this, you get the same result. But this makes it easy to see that some of the dopamine neurons were really bent up and some of them were really bent down. And this is a real result. This is not just like tails of some random, some Gaussian distribution. These are reproducible effects. And the neurons span a wide range. They kind of tile the space of we called it kinkiness. Now, what does this have to do with distributional coding? Well, it turns out that if you just take these RPE signals and you bend them up or down in that way, you automatically get a spectrum from pessimistic to optimistic. Why? Well, temporal difference learning is going to kind of find an equilibrium point when the number of positive RPs that you're getting is the same as the number of negative RPs you're getting, right? That's kind of a balance point. If you have a neuron that's really like exaggerating its positive reward prediction errors, the reference point that you find is going to be optimistic because you're going to try to get fewer of those really loud positive RPEs. That's where you're going to find your equilibrium point. If you're really amping up your negative RPEs, you're going to move your reference point to the negative pessimistic domain in order to get fewer of those really loud negative RPEs. Hopefully that gives you the intuition. what we should find then, as a first prediction here, is that, in fact, different dopamine neurons have different levels of optimism. Some of them are expecting good things, some of them are expecting bad things. What does this look like? Well, we can tell whether a neuron is optimistic or pessimistic by looking at where it flips from negative RPE to positive RPE as we increase the reward level. The point at which it's at kind of neutral corresponds to its value expectation. That's the point at which it isn't surprised. So in the classical case, if we give more and more juice, dopamine neurons should flip from dipping in their activity to increasing in their activity, but they should all flip at the same amount of juice. But in the distributional case, different neurons should flip from negative to positive at different points. And this is just a cartoon, but you can build artificial distributional RL systems, and you can see the difference between a classical system with just a little bit of Gaussian noise injected and a distributional one where the units are crossing the zero line at different points. And what we see in the empirical data, the real neural data looks a lot like the distributional case. And again, we did tons of analyses to convince ourselves that this wasn't just like looking at, kind of kidding ourselves that some randomness in the data was real structure. So you can see it. It's consistent across halves of the data, and even in a single animal, in response to a single amount of juice, you can see some neurons getting all excited, like here, and in response to the same amount of juice, other neurons being disappointed. And this is like reproducible. Okay, another prediction is that these two things that I've talked about, the kinkiness of the neurons and the point at which they flip to positive RPE, those two things should be related for exactly the reasons I described a moment ago. And in fact, we see a very strong positive correlation between the kinkiness of which way a dopamine neuron is kinked and how much, on the one hand, and where its activity crosses that zero line. And then finally, it turns out that, so all of this is supposed to be relating to a distributional code. And it turns out that those first two steps, if you look at the math that underlies them, they correspond to something called quantile regression. And so what you end up with is a bunch of neural responses that really implicitly represent a full distribution of rewards. So if that's true, and if the dopamine neurons are collectively representing the distribution of expected rewards, I should say anticipated rewards, then we should be able to decode that. We should be able to look at the dopamine neurons, pretend we don't know what the distribution of rewards is, and nonetheless extract that information from the dopamine neurons. So in simulation, so these plots show a kind of a smooth version of the actual juice reward distribution. That's the gray in Now's studies. And on the left, you're seeing what happens if you approach a distributional TD system, assuming it is a distributional TD system, and then you use maximum likelihood fit algorithm to try to figure out what's the distribution of rewards that best fits the responses of these artificial dopamine neurons. And you get, at least, the initial conditions matter a lot, but at least you see a multimodal distribution. If you try to do the same thing with a classical TD system, and you say, I'm going to assume this is a distributional TD system, and I'm going to try to decode the actual reward distribution, but actually you're wrong, it's actually a classical TD system, then it doesn't go well. You end up with a unimodal distribution. So what do we see with the actual dopamine neurons? We see something that looks pretty impressively distributional. It's like clearly multimodal, and it actually looks a lot like the real distribution. And this is only with 40 neurons, which kind of blew my mind when we first got that result. So, okay, so that's example number one. And really, that's a whirlwind tour. I'm happy to talk details if anybody's interested in this. But again, really what I want to convey is this is an example where something that we would not be talking about if we didn't have DeepRL turned out to be an interesting inroad into some neuroscientific experiments. Here's another example, and it's completely different, except that it's another example of how DeepRL is cool. Okay, so clear your mind, this is something totally different. So starting with the machine learning description here. Imagine I have a recurrent neural network, and I'm feeding into this recurrent neural network representations of perceptual observations. And I'm asking this network to output actions. So this is this typical setup in a DeepRL system. And we're also going to make some other, hopefully uncontroversial stipulations, we're going to say this system has something like corollary discharge. It gets some information about what action it selected on the last time step. And it also, analogous to that, is going to get some information about what reward it received on the last time step, kind of like as a perceptual input, as it were. And also, because this is a deep RL system, we're going to ask the system to output a value representation. By the way, I'm planning to go to 3, but I do understand that some people may have to run. I won't be affected. Okay, so that's the setup, but there are 2 more things that are going to be really critical. One is, this is going to be a recurrent neural network. So all of the units inside this network are going to talk to all the other units inside this network. They're going to have synapses connecting them, which means there are loops, which means activity can stick around and be transformed over time, which is working memory. It's so nice to be able to say that. Machine learners don't know what working memory is, but it's nice to be here. Okay, and we're going to train this with a standard deep RL algorithm using backprop through time, for those of you who are familiar with that. But there's another critical ingredient, which is going to lead to the cool effect I'm about to describe to you, which is, we're not just going to train this thing on one task. So, as a simple example, I can train this recurrent neural network on a bandit task. It gets to choose between action 1, action 2, maybe left and right, and it finds out for each action how much reward it received, and the reward is probabilistic. Maybe it's based on a Bernoulli parameter, like 0.7 and 0.4 for each of the actions, and it has to kind of explore and exploit and figure out which arm is better. That's one task. You trained it on that task for a while, but then you give it a new bandit task with different parameters, and it has to start from scratch and figure out which arm is good and do the explore exploit thing, and then when it's had some time to work on that, you give it another one and so forth. So this I like to refer to this, as many people do, as a task distribution. It's a bunch of tasks that are all interrelated. They share structure, but they're parameterized differently. It's like a lot like life. So when you combine the elements that I've just described, something happens that to me seemed kind of magical when I first started playing with it. And the way to introduce you to it, if you haven't heard about it before, is we're going to freeze the weights. We're going to turn off the reinforcement learning algorithm. So, think of a brain where the synapses are held constant. They are not allowed to change. There is no synaptic learning going on. And now we give this network, which has dealt with a bunch of bandit problems, a new bandit problem with parameters that it's never dealt with before. But it can't change its connection weights. How is it going to learn? It turns out it learns just fine. So if you look at what it does, in an easy case, it'll kind of pick the left arm, and then it'll pick the right arm, pick the left arm, and then it goes, yeah, you know what, the right arm's better, I'm just sticking with it. If it's a harder problem, it'll explore longer. And then if you look at its behavior the way that you would a human's behavior in a bandit problem, and you compute the cumulative regret, actually the system not only learns, but it learns pretty efficiently. It does what it's it approximates the optimal explore-exploit trade-off. Actually, this plot isn't even as good as later ones we got, but you can see it approximating standard machine learning algorithms here in terms of its cumulative regret. So how is it doing this? How is it possibly learning how to solve this bandit problem when its synapses are frozen? Well, the answer is, sorry, I forgot about these builds. The answer is the only answer that's available, which is that it must be something about its activity dynamics. It's using its working memory to kind of remember what it did and how much reward it got, and using that memory to decide what to do next. So it's like the reinforcement learning algorithm that's tuned the weights in this network, which define the dynamics, the activity dynamics, have given birth to another reinforcement learning algorithm, which is inherent in the activity dynamics of the system. That's why this is a case of meta learning. And so you can see this, you can see what's going on if you look at the internal activity patterns in a network of this kind after it's been trained, and do dimensionality reduction so you can get some sense of how they're evolving. So, sensible things are happening there. So if you give it a bandit problem where the right action is on the left, you might see the internal representation kind of tracking in a particular direction in latent space. If you take the same network and give it a problem where it's the other action that's optimal, you see it tracking in another direction. If the problem's hard and it kind of changes its mind halfway through, you'll see it kind of changing its mind in latent space. But the point is that what's happening is the learning is happening in working memory, right? It's at the level of activity patterns. Now, sorry, I forgot about all this. Skip it. So that's cool enough. But actually, there's another side of this that really got me excited and continues to get me excited, which is that second learned algorithm that's in the dynamics of the network, it doesn't have to be the same as the original learning algorithm in any way. It can be whatever it wants to be. And what it turns out to be is something that's adapted to the statistics of the world in which it grew up. This second learned algorithm is, because it evolves in the task distribution, it understands the structure of that task distribution and it can exploit it. So to give you a simple example, imagine that I gave this system a series of bandit problems, but now I introduce structure. In particular, I tie the parameters. So the Bernoulli parameter on every right arm is just 1 minus the parameter on the left arm. And I keep sampling new parameters, but I always insist on that regularity. In that situation, if I freeze the weights and give the agent a new task that fits within this manifold, the agent learns much faster. Because, so to speak, it knows that the parameters are tied. So it knows any information it gets from the left arm gives it some information about the right arm, which wasn't true before when the parameters were independent. Okay? And so this is meta-learning where it's not just meta-learning. It's not just, oh, cool, one learning algorithm gave rise to another. It's that new algorithm is more intelligent than the first one because it knows about the structure of the world and it can exploit that. Okay, so that's clearly an example of a case where DeepRL gives rise to something that wouldn't happen in the case of simple reinforcement learning or deep learning alone. But now let's take it to neuroscience. And again, this is going to be like a whirlwind tour. I only have a few minutes left, but I'll give you the gist of this paper where we applied this meta reinforcement learning idea to actually a whole bunch of findings from the neuroscience literature, and it ended up giving a very coherent explanation for what seemed like disparate findings. So how do we map this thing onto neuroscience? Well, let's be facile. We know that the literature says that dopamine signals a reward prediction errors, so we'll just treat the reward prediction error signals in our DeepRL system as if they were dopamine. And we know that the brain implements working memory in sustained activity, and that's especially true in the prefrontal circuit, so we're just going to be facile and say the recurrent network here, as simple as it is, has something in common with the recurrent circuitry that underlies working memory in the frontal cortex. And we'll go from there, see how far we can get. So how far can we get? Well, let's start with this bandit-like task from Susui and colleagues in the Schultz lab. Here, an animal had to look toward a left target or a right target, just like pulling one arm or another in a bandit task. And the details of the task I won't get into, but suffice to say that the right thing to do, I feel like this is ringing a little bit. Sorry about that. The right thing to do in this task is not to pick an arm and pick the best arm and stick with it, but instead to do something called probability matching. So just in the interest of time, this is a pattern showing an animal's behavior, showing that the animal kind of balances its behavior across the two arms, but in a way that's sort of proportional to the rewards it's getting from the two arms. Turns out if you train our little recurrent neural network on the same task, but with the parameters changing from block to block, as in the Susui study, the system does the same thing, which is kind of cool. If you read the paper on the literature on probability matching, there are all sorts of special purpose algorithms that have been proposed. This just probability matching just happens here because it's the right thing to do. And this is happening again in the activity dynamics of the network. The weights are frozen. But we can look at those internal representations and now compare them to neural activity, because Susui and colleagues actually recorded from prefrontal cortex. And what we see is striking. So in the Susui data, neurons coded for a small set of parameters. One was, what action is the animal about to perform? What are the values that the animal believes attached to each of the two actions? Importantly, what's the recent history? What actions have I executed recently, and how much reward did I get? And this is a histogram of the neurons in prefrontal cortex that coded for those things, and we see exactly the same thing in our network. So this is a hint that even as simple as the system is, it might be doing something akin to what's going on in the prefrontal cortex. And maybe what's going on in the prefrontal cortex is learned through reinforcement learning in the same way. Okay, another example. So I said before that this learned learning algorithm can be whatever it wants. It doesn't have to be like the original learning algorithm. And here's an example. This is one of my favorite cognitive neuroscience studies by Tim Behrens and colleagues. They did a bandit task with human subjects, and the task went through different phases. Sometimes the arm that was best, the action that was best, would stay constant for a long time. It's a stable domain. And sometimes it would flip around more rapidly, and this is a volatile domain. And what Tim and his colleagues found in studying human behavior is that humans essentially lower their learning rate when things are stable, and they raise their learning rate when things get volatile. This turns out to be the right thing to do, because when you raise your learning rate, you kind of wash out earlier observations and you pay attention more to recent things. So during the stable domains indicated in blue, the learning rate fell. During the volatile domains in blue here, the learning rate went up. So we trained our recurrent neural network with a fixed learning rate, just one learning rate, a very low learning rate. And then we froze the weights, and we looked at what the network did, and we, just like Tim and his colleagues, we inferred what the effective learning rate was from the behavior of the system, and it looked, sorry, I forgot about all these arrows, I apologize. But it looks just like Tim's data. So this network has learned a learning algorithm that adjusts its learning rate in just the way it should in this task. Okay, I'm gonna skip that slide. All right, I have like 2 minutes left, so I'm just gonna give you the flavor of a couple more things, then I'll conclude. So it turns out that you can also use this simple meta-RL system to explain interesting things about dopamine. So this is a very simple and clever study by Ethan Bromberg-Martin. Animals were given a left target to fixate or a right target to fixate, and one of those would be rewarded and one wouldn't. So in some blocks, the left target was rewarded, in some blocks, the right target was rewarded. But importantly, the animal didn't know when it transitioned from one block to another, other than by observing the reward outcomes. And what Ethan observed was, some of it was very consistent with the classical dopamine story. So if you've been getting rewarded for left, and a left stimulus comes on, then dopamine gets excited, because that's been going, in recent history, that's been rewarded. But what happens right after a reversal? So the animal gets a left target, it gets excited, oh, but now it's not rewarded. It knows from that a reversal has happened. What happens on the very next trial? Well, if it gets another left, the animal just experienced that left isn't rewarded. So you better hope that dopamine is going to be disappointed if it gets another left. So that's just standard, and that's what Ethan sees. But the cool thing is if the animal, right after that reversal, gets a right stimulus. So the last time it got a right stimulus, it was unrewarded. But what Ethan sees is that, in fact, dopamine gets excited. In fact, this plot isn't even really representative of how excited. In other data, it's much peakier. So what this implies is that the animal understands the structure of the task. It can infer that now this stimulus is going to be rewarded, even though I haven't recently experienced it rewarded, just because I understand how this task works. It turns out that if you just train our ordinary recurrent neural network on this task and let it flip back and forth for a while, and then put it in exactly these situations and look at its reward prediction errors, they do exactly this. Because the latent state of the network, the activity dynamics of the network, are keeping track of what recently happened, and they absorb information about the structure of the transition structure of the task. They're outputting the value estimate. That's a basis for the reward prediction error. So it's not mysterious how this happens under the meta-RL system. Okay, I don't really have time to go into this slide, but I'll just say there is another kind of magical thing that happens here, which is that even though we're training this system using a model-free RL algorithm, its behavior, if you analyze it the way that many people in cognitive neuroscience have done, to detect whether it's model-free or model-based, its behavior looks for all the world model-based. So I said before that learned learning algorithm can be different from the original algorithm, and this is a radical case of that. You have a model-free learning algorithm giving birth to a model-based learning algorithm. It's just like a freak of nature. All right, but I don't have time to go into the details. Anyway, okay, so just to close. Obviously, this has been like a very speedy tour through a couple of studies. And as I keep saying, really what I'm trying to convey to you is that deep reinforcement learning is giving rise to phenomena that we haven't encountered before, computational phenomena. They don't happen in deep learning. They don't happen in reinforcement learning without the deep learning part. when you bring these two things together, new stuff happens, and that new stuff is really interesting from a neuroscience and psychology point of view. And it's not just that. So just before I close, I want to just mention some of my colleagues and I at DeepMind are writing a review paper on this stuff, just to point out all the different kinds of questions you can ask in a new way if you just look at how deep RL systems work and the kinds of deep RL systems that are being built nowadays. And they're questions relating to representation learning, to model-based RL, to memory, to exploration and how that happens, to cognitive control and action hierarchies, even connectomics. People are building deep RL systems that evolve their architectural form, and also social cognition. I showed you the capture the flag video, but people are even building multi-agent RL systems where there are like social dilemmas, tragedy of the common type situations, and looking at how those play out in deep RL systems, and how the systems come to represent the world in that context. And just one last tiny note, I've really concentrated in all the things I've said in this kind of like path from AI work to neuroscience. And I think, look, AI and neuroscience have been partners for a long time, and sometimes AI is kind of in the lead, and sometimes neuroscience is in the lead. I think in some ways, right in this particular moment, AI is kind of in the lead just because of these recent breakthroughs. But it won't be long if we kind of all work together to bring the insights that are coming out of that AI work into the neuroscience and psychology we're doing now. It won't be long before neuroscience and psychology are kind of closing that loop. And I'm excited for that. But just the last thing I want to say is just to acknowledge my collaborators. The main people who worked on the work that I've described include Jane Wong, Zeb Nelson, and Will Dabney at DeepMind, and now Cheetah at Harvard. And thank you. Thanks. I suspect many of you are going to have to duck out, but I'm happy to stick around and what should we do? Conrad, should we do question and answer, or should we just break and talk one-on-one?
Yeah, I'm sure there's questions that you need to answer after this talk. Okay, so we have time for a few questions, definitely.
How long did you train the DeepRL, the recurrent? Like, how many examples did you show it?
It's very domain dependent, and we have never done simulations where we tried to see how little training we could get away with. So the answer in a way wouldn't be informative. I can tell you, for the bandit problems we did like a million bandit problems in training, but that's just a number we chose. That doesn't necessarily correspond to the lower bound on what you can get away with. What we did do is we were careful to hold out task parameterizations. So it wouldn't be so interesting if we did so much training that we basically presented every possible parameterization of the task. So that's one thing we're very careful to do. But yeah, I know that's a flaky answer, but it's the best one I can give. And it's going to be hugely domain dependent.
That StarCraft study, first of all, actually very cool talk. Thank you.
Thanks.
The StarClass study is really cool. One thing I think is interesting about my work is it seems like the objective is always to build something that is way better than humans are. And so I wonder, how should we be cautious about the way that we try and use machine learning to understand the brain better, what you think the limitations are, etc. Could you just critique your own talk, if that's okay?
I do it every day. That's kind of my job, actually, when I'm not here. So we're clearly already to a place where systems of this kind can do things that surprise us. So this is famously true of AlphaGo. AlphaGo made moves that everybody thought were crazy, and then it turned out AlphaGo won, and you could kind of, in retrospect, look back and see why that move was freaking brilliant, right? And that's part of the solution discovery bit that I find so fascinating. So as an answer to your question, let me link it to the second study that I described. So as we were doing that work, there were some things that we did that are reported in the paper that are cognitively more interesting, that involve kind of variable binding and dealing with objects that haven't been encountered before and so forth. So like you can actually do some cognitively really interesting things even with this simple network. But one like catchphrase that I kept coming up with as we were doing that work was, meta learning is only as interesting as the abstractions that underlie the task distribution. And so one problem that we have, if we want, like there's a big kind of debate going on right now in certain sectors of the AI world. How much should we build into our systems or try to build into our systems? And how much should we just hope will come out of learning? And if you believe that you want to, if you're on the learning side, as most people are these days, right or wrong, you need environments that, and you want to use this meta learning approach, right? You believe, as I do in part, that like flexibility and rapid learning is going to come out of this sort of meta learning mechanism. Then you may not build a lot of stuff into your agents, but you're going to have to build a lot of stuff into your environments, right? Because we're not to a point yet where we have robots that we can kind of release into this real interesting world that we live in, and that might be dangerous anyway. So we're doing everything through simulation. So we're actually having to build environments. And if you then have to build, then we're in a position of saying, well, we're interested in seeing whether agents can acquire this particular concept, whatever that concept is. Oh, well, now we have to build an environment where that agent has the opportunity to acquire that concept, and we can tell when it has the concept. And that's one thing I worry about is what killed classical AI was the demand that people finally recognized that they had to build all of human knowledge into the agent. And I'm a little bit worried that if we continue doing everything in simulation, we're going to be on the hook for the same thing. We're going to have to build all of human knowledge into the environment. And that's daunting. But having said that, I think we can at least get to the next stage of cognitive interestingness by building. Fortunately, the tools we have for building environments are getting more and more sophisticated. So Unity, for example, is a great boon. But yeah, so I have a colleague who calls this the problem. We have really great agents, but their greatness will only show through if they're trained in really rich, structured environments, and we're kind of on the hook for building those.
So let me ask a question. So if we talk about learning to learn, should we think about this like it's learning that people do, or should we think about it that it's like evolution that we did over the last years?
I think of it as both, and that's a little bit glib, simply in the sense that the actual simulations feel much more like learning over the lifetime of a single individual. There are evolutionary methods that people use for building neural networks that I suppose we could have used to get at the same thing. We wrote a paper for ticks last year. That was kind of a summary and follow-up on this meta-learning stuff. We entitled it Reinforcement Learning Fast and Slow. And actually, toward the end of that paper, we broached this issue. Look, we're not saying that all learning has to be within a lifetime. A lot of learning can happen over evolutionary time, but in a way, that's just another instance of meta-learning. So let's not. So I for some reason, well, it's kind of obvious maybe why, but I often go to meetings where Josh Tenenbaum is present, and I always love seeing him. But he and others who kind of travel in the same circle they're very intent on studying the knowledge that babies have, right? And the argument that I've heard from him is, well, look, if you want to solve AGI, you have to figure out what babies have on board, and then we have to build that into our agents, and then we'll get the kind of fast, flexible learning that we're looking for. And I don't understand the argument. I mean, so many of you will have seen this really great paper by Brendan Lake and others, including Josh. There was a science paper focusing on omniglot, and then there was a BBS paper talking about like why DQN is bad and why we should think instead about generative models of the environment, do inference over those. And so my way of summarizing this is, Brendan built, in order to explain how humans deal with these kind of novel glyphs in this science paper, he built a generative model of handwriting. And what I wanted to know is how much data went into Brendan's ability to build that model, right? Like how much data had Brendan himself consumed over the course of his lifetime, including all of graduate school? And then how much data had all of his ancestors accumulated that ended up in his genes? Like that's the real story, right? Like there's no free lunch. And I think so, you know, I really do think that I'm like a radical empiricist. I don't think there is any built-in knowledge. I think everything's come from the data. But in order for that story to fly, you have to take evolution into account. That's my punchline. Yeah.
Why don't we take one last question?
Yeah, I have the following question. You're kind of comparing deep learning networks to the way the brain is organized. In the brain, we have really complex organizations with many different cell types that are there ultimately for some reason, presumably to process information and learn information in a specific way.
Yeah.
Furthermore, that connections are built into sort of menu of the convolutional networks, deep learning networks models in the brain are present in very different ways. Even within the cortex, the feedback rate is different layers than the output layers.
Yeah.
And I was wondering to what extent can you use that kind of those differences to explain in one way? Can we ask questions to what extent is this complexity even useful in much simpler systems to solve the same task? And vice versa, whether adding this complexity can make you know, AI better.
Yeah. The best I can do in answering that is just to kind of sketch out the landscape of possibilities. I don't know that I have any more I'm no further toward an answer to that question than anybody else. But I can at least assure you that the people who are trying to bridge between deep learning and AI have this issue in mind. So when it comes to, I mean, there are certain kind of glib answers I can give. Oh yeah, well, you know, recurrent, like feedback connections are there in recurrent networks. So some people like to say, oh, all these systems are feed forward. The brain doesn't feed forward. That like there are much more interesting versions of this to get into. And I recognize that you were not raising that question. You were talking about just more structure. So one thing that I worry about is that well, we don't know what synaptic learning algorithm the brain is using, but if it is using something like backprop, and I don't know, if you look at the history of application of backprop nets to neuroscience data, like backprop nets, like always, the results always look hauntingly like what the brain ends up with. So I'm seriously suspicious that the brain does something like backprop. That's something that reasonable people can disagree on. But if the brain is doing something like backprop, then it really doesn't matter. The heterogeneity among neurons kind of doesn't matter, because backprop will just use neurons as they should be used, right? If you have different tuning curves on different neurons, then like the function will be inverted, and like the gradients will just figure out how to use that neuron. So part of me worries that maybe all of the attention that's being lavished on heterogeneity of neurons, like deciding which proteins are being expressed. I'm not sure backprop cares. Again, I might be, like, this intuition may be completely wrong. It's an empirical question. On the other hand, the kind of architectural structure that you see in the brain could play a number of roles that, for which there are already corresponding concepts in DeepRL. One is architectural bias. So the breakthrough in deep learning that I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, this 2012 paper, part of the breakthrough was that they used a particular architecture, which had repeating patterns of connection weights. Something called a convolutional neural network. Many of you will be familiar with these. And it was inspired by what we felt we knew about the hierarchical structure of the ventral stream. That we have these feature detectors that are kind of tiled across the entire visual field. And it also happens to capture, it implements an inductive bias in the sense that this network assumes that the data that you're giving it are translationally invariant. Like if it's good to have a kitten detector over here, it's probably also good to have a kitten detector over there. And it's okay for those kitten detectors to be the same. If you know that that's a property of your data, you might as well just copy the weights. That's what a convolutional neural network is. So any architecture that you can come up with is like, it's almost it logically follows that it's associated with some inductive bias. Maybe it's not always as easy to identify as that. So maybe the architecture that you're talking about in the brain is there because it imposes some inductive bias and just leads the brain down the right path toward the right kinds of representations. I don't know. It also could be that the architecture, if what learning involves is something like gradient-based learning, maybe the gradients flow better in that architecture. One of the big breakthroughs in artificial neural networks was the inventions of something called an LSTM network, which is a particular kind of architecture for doing recurrent back propagation through time. And it just so happens that if you build the architecture in this way, the gradients flow better and learning happens better. So, I mean, these are, as I said at the beginning, this is just the landscape of ideas. But I think these issues are of great interest, and as we get better and better data about that kind of connectivity, I think we'll be able to test hypotheses a little bit more precisely, and I won't have to stand up here for the next 10 years blabbing and not giving you an answer. Yeah. Okay, cool.
I guess we should thank our speaker.
Thank you.